What if I told you that the Middle Ages, the era so often romanticized as chivalrous, devout, and painfully proper, was actually one of the wildest, most sexually unhinged periods in human history? Forget the pious monks and modest maidens you've been told about. Behind closed doors, and sometimes in full public view, medieval society was engaged in acts so bizarre, so contradictory, and so shameless that they make today's wildest dating app stories look like polite tea parties. If you dare to uncover the disturbing, hilarious, and downright shocking truth about medieval intimacy, hit that subscribe button now, because we are just getting started. Our journey begins with a practice so awkward, it could only have been invented by people who feared pleasure, yet couldn't stop arranging situations dripping with temptation. It was called bundling. Imagine this: you're a young man, your parents have chosen a potential spouse, and you're told you'll be spending the night together. But instead of candlelight and whispered confessions, you're stuffed into a giant sack, fully clothed, and laid beside your equally bundled date, separated by a thick wooden board meant to keep your bodies apart. The theory was simple, at least in the minds of the parents: allow the young couple to bond without allowing physical sin. In reality, it was the medieval equivalent of locking two hungry people in a bakery and telling them not to touch the bread. Families didn't just tolerate bundling. They encouraged it, seeing it as a wholesome, supervised way for their children to get to know each other. Special bundling bags were even sold, an entire cottage industry dedicated to preventing intimacy by forcing people to sleep inches from one another. Of course, nature has a way of making a mockery of human rules. Historical records show that pregnancy rates among bundling couples were higher than among those who courted in more traditional ways. It turns out that if you place two hormonal young people in a bed, barriers or not, the odds are not in your favor. Religious leaders railed against the practice, calling it immoral and dangerous, but it had sunk so deeply into rural culture that it proved almost impossible to stop, like trying to ban gossip in a small town. If bundling was the appetizer in this bizarre medieval feast, then the main course was quite literally on the table. Medieval Europe had a thriving tradition of aphrodisiac banquets. These were not your modern strawberries and chocolate affairs. No, these feasts featured dishes designed to ignite desire, with ingredients that would make today's health inspectors faint. Chief among them were animal testicles, young bulls, rams, and boars, considered the ultimate in sexual potency. These delicacies, coyly referred to as stones in cookbooks, were prepared in every way imaginable: roasted to a crisp, boiled in fragrant broths, fried in spiced oils, ground into powders, or even mixed into wine. And testicles were just the beginning. Sparrow brains, deer penises, and the reproductive organs of various animals all made appearances based on the belief that consuming fertility would create fertility. It was sympathetic magic, only with far more organ meat. The spice trade, so often romanticized as a quest for flavor and wealth, had another layer: lust. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, saffron. These weren't just culinary treasures. They were believed to stoke the fires of passion. Nobles would pay fortunes for these imports, not just to show off their wealth at feasts, but to ensure that every bite carried a promise of better performance in the bedchamber. Perhaps the most astonishing fact, these aphrodisiac feasts were often served at weddings. Picture it: after exchanging vows in a solemn church ceremony, the newlyweds and their guests sit down to a 7-course meal of animal genitals and brain matter, all intended to supercharge the wedding night. Even the wedding cake was loaded with sexually stimulating ingredients like pine nuts, almonds, and honey, not for flavor, but for fertility. This wasn't fringe superstition. Medieval physicians and scholars wrote entire treatises on aphrodisiac foods, complete with detailed recipes and preparation notes. Surviving manuscripts carry titles like "On the Generation of Seed and Foods That Increase Lust," and they were treated as legitimate medical texts. The obsession was so intense that certain ingredients were banned during religious fasts not because they were unhealthy, but because they were too sexually stimulating for those meant to be contemplating God. But as wild as aphrodisiac feasts were they pale in comparison to the public spectacle of the medieval bedding ceremony. In certain noble marriages, consummation wasn't just a private act, it was a public requirement. The bride and groom would be escorted to their bed by a procession of guests, undressed by relatives of their own gender, and then watched by high-ranking nobles, church officials, and family members as they performed the marital act. Privacy was not only discouraged, it was sometimes considered legally invalid. The logic behind this jaw-dropping tradition was in its own twisted way straightforward. Marriage in the medieval aristocracy was as much a business contract as a romantic union. Land titles and enormous sums of money were often at stake. For the contract to be legally binding, it had to be consummated, and that meant witnesses had to verify the act had taken place. Imagine having to perform your most intimate moment in front of an audience simply to finalize a land deal. These witnesses didn't just peek in and leave. Some stayed for the entire duration, occasionally offering encouragement advice or bizarrely commentary as though it were a tournament to be judged. In the most invasive cases, the morning after involved inspecting the bed sheets for blood, which was taken as proof of the bride's virginity and evidence of successful penetration. These stained sheets were sometimes preserved as legal documents, grim trophies in the strange theater of noble marriage. Not every couple took kindly to this ritual. Some tried to negotiate a compromise, allowing witnesses to wait outside the bedchamber door instead of hovering over them. But even this could backfire if the marriage's legality was later challenged. Courts could annul the union for lack of proper supervision. That meant repeating the entire humiliating ordeal from start to finish with the appropriate number of eyes watching this time. For the medieval elite, even the timing of conception was a matter of elaborate strategy. Sex was not simply about desire, it was a meticulously planned event dictated by astrology, medicine, and religious doctrine. Couples consulted astrologers to determine the most favorable planetary alignments for conceiving children, believing that the stars themselves influenced the fate of their offspring. Medieval medical texts prescribed a dizzying set of requirements. The optimal time of day, usually midnight. The best weather warm and humid, and even the ideal direction the bed should face east toward the rising sun. Some believed conception on particular saints' feast days would bless the child with divine favor. As if planning a siege or royal coronation, couples cross-referenced calendars, consulted charts, and adjusted their schedules in pursuit of the perfect cosmic moment. Perhaps the most eyebrow-raising belief was that boys came from the right testicle and girls from the left. To tip the odds in their favor, men were instructed to tie off one testicle before intercourse, an act as uncomfortable as it was absurd. And yet, this peculiar superstition persisted for centuries, a testament to the medieval willingness to turn reproductive science into high-stakes guesswork. Overlaying all this was the crushing weight of religious restrictions. The church forbade sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, during Lent, during Advent, during menstruation, during pregnancy, while breastfeeding, and on over 180 additional holy days scattered throughout the year. Finding a day when marital intimacy wasn't technically a sin was like navigating a minefield, and many couples resorted to priests, physicians, and astrologers to map out the precious few permissible windows. In fact, wealthy families sometimes hired fertility consultants, a hybrid of doctor-priest and star reader, whose sole job was to design bespoke conception schedules. These specialists analyzed the couple's birth charts, medical histories, and religious obligations, then handed over a calendar of approved dates and times. The pressure was immense, particularly when the future of dynasties hinged on producing heirs. But even the most carefully orchestrated plans were useless if the couple couldn't physically conceive. and that's where magical underwear came in. Yes, medieval Europe had a thriving trade in fertility accessories, from the so-called girdle of Venus silk, or linen belts inscribed with prayers and symbols, to amulets filled with powdered unicorn horn and reality, narwhal tusk. These items were worn directly against the skin, often during intercourse, in the belief that they enhanced fertility and protected against miscarriage. The creativity or desperation didn't stop there. Women might wear amulets containing crushed gemstones, each stone supposedly linked to a specific outcome. Emeralds for boys, sapphires for girls, diamonds for twins. Some carried conception stones in their undergarments during sex, believing the stone's power would seep into their womb. Men, not to be left out, had their own bizarre accessories: blessed loincloths, rings set with animal parts, often testicles naturally, and talismans meant to improve stamina. The church, ever pragmatic when money was involved, happily blessed these objects for a fee. Some fertility accessories were so elaborate they came with instruction manuals. Surviving manuscripts detail how to wear certain belts, which prayers to recite while fastening them, and even what to do if they stopped working. In wealthy households, these items were made of imported silk, gold thread, and precious stones, a public display of both status and supposed sexual potency. Poorer couples made do with homemade versions from local cloth and charms, creating an unspoken hierarchy where the quality of your magical underwear reflected your social class. The belief in these accessories ran so deep that some women refused to have intercourse without them convinced conception was impossible otherwise. Conversely, some men wouldn't sleep with a woman unless she was properly equipped, turning superstition into a gatekeeper for intimacy. Getting dressed in this case was not merely preparation, it was a prerequisite for getting laid. But what if the problem wasn't fertility, but the inability of the husband to perform at all? In the medieval world, impotence could be grounds for annulling a marriage, but only if it could be proven. Enter the public nightmare known as the impotence trial. These were not whispered disputes in dark corners. They were full-blown legal proceedings, complete with judges, medical experts, and curious onlookers eager for scandal. First came the medical examinations. Both husband and wife would be inspected separately for physical abnormalities. Then came the interrogations under oath about the frequency of attempts, the details of what happened or failed to happen in bed, and whether either partner was at fault. But the true humiliation was reserved for the final stage, the trial by Congress. If the initial evidence was inconclusive, the court could order the couple to attempt intercourse under supervision. This might take place in a special chamber within the courthouse, or in a private room rigged with peepholes for judges and physicians to observe. The couple was given a set amount of time to complete the act, and their performance or lack thereof would determine the marriage's fate. Some men tried to cheat the system, smuggling in aphrodisiacs made from herbs, animal parts, or magical concoctions. Court officials quickly caught on, instituting pre-examination checks to ensure no artificial assistance was being used. In one recorded case, a man was caught with a small pouch of powdered bull testicles hidden in his clothing, a last desperate attempt at salvaging his pride. These trials could drag on for months, with repeated supervised sessions if the judges deemed it necessary. Some couples were subjected to the ordeal dozens of times, as if repeated humiliation might somehow change the result. The social fallout was brutal. Even those who won their case often found themselves the subject of ridicule and gossip for years afterward. For many men, the threat of an impotence trial was so terrifying that they would rather accept an annulment than endure the spectacle, effectively admitting defeat to preserve what little dignity they had left. Women, on the other hand, faced their own humiliations, having to prove their sexual willingness and capability as though the inability of their husbands might somehow be their fault. And while these courtrooms were dissecting the intimate failures of couples, the church was running a sexual enterprise of its own, one far more lucrative and far-reaching. In 12th century London, the Bishop of Winchester controlled an entire district of licensed brothels employing over 1,000 prostitutes. It was not a shadowy scandal, but an open institutionalized system. The Church justified its involvement by declaring prostitution a necessary evil, claiming it prevented worse sins such as rape, adultery, and sodomy. They couldn't officially condone it, but canon law didn't forbid collecting rent from brothel owners. The arrangement was as profitable as it was hypocritical, funneling money from sex work directly into religious coffers, funding church construction, monastery upkeep, and religious festivals, all paid for by the very acts the pulpit condemned. The brothels under church control operated with a strict set of rules. Prostitutes had to follow dress codes, work only during designated hours, and live within assigned areas of the city. They were forbidden to work on religious holidays, could not refuse clients without an approved reason, and were required to undergo regular medical inspections. This was less about their welfare, and more about ensuring the product remained marketable to paying customers. Financially, it was a pyramid scheme. The prostitutes paid rent to brothel keepers, who paid rent to property owners, who in turn paid taxes or leases to the church. Every transaction funneled profit upward, while the workers at the bottom earned just enough to survive. The most staggering part was how normal this system became, lasting for centuries, without collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Even when reformers attempted to shut these church-owned brothels down, they faced fierce resistance, not just from religious leaders but from secular authorities. Too many people in power were profiting from the arrangement. It was an unholy alliance between morality and money, and for generations it seemed untouchable. Eventually, social attitudes began to shift. Protestant reformers openly attacked the hypocrisy and growing public discomfort with the church's dual role as moral authority, and sex industry landlord made the system harder to defend. But by the time it was dismantled, the church had already spent centuries building, decorating, and expanding its influence with funds from the world's oldest profession. If the church's control of prostitution seems outrageous, wait until you hear about medieval contraception. The methods were so bizarre, so risky, and so hopelessly ineffective that they make even the strangest modern myths look reasonable. At the heart of many of these remedies was a recurring theme: animal testicles, because apparently no sexual problem could be solved without them. One common belief was that wearing a pouch containing weasel testicles around the neck could prevent conception. The reasoning weasels were thought to be highly sexual, yet bore only small litters. By wearing their reproductive organs, a woman could supposedly transfer this controlled fertility to herself. It was as illogical as it sounds, yet it was practiced widely enough to be recorded in multiple regions. Other methods were far more dangerous. Women drank potions made from ground beaver testicles mixed with wine-powdered iron, dissolved in water, or even concoctions containing mercury. Some quite literally poisoned themselves trying to avoid pregnancy, a method that, while fatal, was technically 100% effective. There were also techniques that seem laughable now, like the sneezing method. Physicians advised women to sneeze immediately after intercourse to expel the man's seed. Some women carried pepper or other irritants in small pouches, ready to induce a violent sneeze at a moment's notice. The image is almost comical until you remember it was taken seriously as medical advice. Physical barriers were equally strange and often revolting. Honey-soaked wool was a common choice, as was crocodile dung, a practice borrowed from ancient Egyptian traditions. Some women used half a lemon as a makeshift cervical cap, which, while potentially acidic enough to harm sperm, must have been both uncomfortable and impractical. The timing method, too, was doomed from the start. Medieval physicians believed women were most fertile during menstruation, and least fertile mid-cycle, the exact opposite of reality. Couples, relying on this misinformation, often found themselves with unexpected pregnancies blissfully unaware that their safe days were in fact the most fertile. Magical contraception was an entire category of its own, blending superstition with ritual. Women might wear amulets containing written spells, carry stones thought to have protective powers, or perform elaborate ceremonies, burning specific herbs, burying symbolic objects under the light of a full moon, or walking backward around a church 3 times while reciting prayers. The logic was fuzzy at best, but in a world where science was limited, magic offered a sense of control over fate. Some of these charms were highly specific. A spell might require the woman to recite a particular psalm while holding a piece of bread baked at sunrise, or to bury a rooster's feather beneath the marital bed. The steps were often so convoluted that simply completing them must have felt like an accomplishment regardless of whether they actually worked. Even the withdrawal method known since ancient times was treated with suspicion. Medieval physicians warned that it could cause madness, blindness, and even death in men, claiming that incomplete ejaculation allowed poisonous humors to build up inside the body. It was yet another example of how limited anatomical knowledge could turn common sense into mortal fear. Taken together, these practices paint a picture of a society both obsessed with and terrified by sex. People created barriers, rules, and rituals to control it, yet continually devised ways to bend or break those same constraints. It was a cultural tug-of-war between desire and discipline, pleasure and piety, where neither side ever truly won. If bundling bags and fertility belts seem absurd, remember they existed in the same world that normalized public bedding ceremonies and church-run brothels. The medieval mind could somehow reconcile divine commandments with debauchery, seeing no contradiction in blessing an amulet one day and condemning lust the next. And yet beneath the humor and shock value, there is a darker truth. Many of these customs, whether humiliating court trials, invasive inspections, or forced public consummations, were about power control and ownership. Women's bodies were treated as political currency, men's virility as proof of legitimacy, and sexuality itself as a tool for reinforcing the social order. The Middle Ages were not simply an age of ignorance. They were an age of contradictions, where faith and superstition coexisted, where medicine and magic intertwined, and where the most intimate aspects of life were often subject to public scrutiny. Every bizarre practice had roots in genuine fears, fear of illegitimate heirs, of divine punishment, of losing status or property. Some of these fears still echo today, though the rituals have changed. We may laugh at the idea of crocodile dung as birth control, but modern myths and misinformation about sex are hardly less strange when seen through the lens of future centuries. Our own era's obsessions, from miracle diets to detox cures, are cut from the same cloth as medieval aphrodisiac feasts and fertility talismans. In the end, medieval sexuality reveals more about human nature than about the era itself. Desire is constant. It adapts to the rules imposed upon it. Where there is prohibition, there will be loopholes. Where there is fear, there will be ritual. And where there is money to be made, even the holiest institutions will find a way to justify the trade. So, next time, you imagine the Middle Ages as a time of pure chivalry and courtly love. Remember the bundling bags, the gemstone underwear, the witnessed wedding nights, and the church's brothel empire. History is never as tidy as the stories we tell, and sometimes it's a whole lot stranger. And if you think this was the peak of medieval weirdness, just wait until you hear what they did with corpses. The link between death and sex in medieval superstition is unsettling, but it was real. Some communities believed that certain body parts from the dead could be used as powerful aphrodisiacs or fertility charms. In rare, whispered-about cases, fragments of bone or dried organs were ground into powders and slipped into drinks, often without the recipient's knowledge, under the belief that the life force of the deceased could reignite fading passion. These macabre practices were usually carried out in secret, hidden from the church's official gaze, though sometimes cloaked in thin layers of religious justification. A widow might claim she was honoring her late husband's spirit by keeping part of him close, when in reality the relic was intended to influence her next relationship. In an age where relics of saints were openly venerated, it wasn't a far leap for some to treat human remains as tools of the flesh rather than the soul. This grim crossover between death and desire underscored a broader medieval truth: sexuality was never entirely private. Whether in the courts, the church, or the marketplace, intimate matters were regularly exposed to public judgment, regulation, and even performance. It was a society that viewed the body, living or dead, as a stage for moral, legal, and mystical drama. Consider again the bedding ceremonies, the impotence trials, the regulated brothels. All of these normalize the idea that sex could be supervised, scored, and monetized. In modern terms, it's like living in a reality show where every intimate decision has an audience, and every action is measured against a shifting set of rules you didn't create. And yet, for all the control exerted by church and state, people found endless ways to navigate, bend, or outright defy the rules. Bundling couples quietly pushed barriers aside. Nobles used aphrodisiac feasts to mask their indulgence as tradition. Fertility charms and magical underwear gave people a sense of agency in a system designed to restrict them. The ingenuity of these workarounds is almost admirable until you remember the dangers involved. Mercury potions, poisonous herbs, and unsanitary animal parts weren't just ineffective. They could cause illness, infertility, or death. And still, the promise of control over desire, fertility, or performance was enough for many to take the risk. That willingness to risk everything for even the illusion of control is perhaps the most enduring human trait revealed by these stories. Whether through the blessing of a belt, the timing of the moon, or the placement of a wooden board between two bodies, people clung to the belief that desire could be managed like any other household duty. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at the absurdity: the sneezing method, the gemstone underwear, the crocodile dung. But in doing so, we're also looking in a mirror. Our modern age has its own set of strange rituals, dubious remedies, and contradictory rules surrounding sex and relationships. The packaging has changed, but the motivations remain eerily familiar. The Middle Ages remind us that sexuality has always been a site of negotiation between individual will and collective control. The bizarre, the grotesque, and the hypocritical are not accidents of history. They are byproducts of systems that mix morality with power and desire with fear. In this sense, the medieval world is not as far removed from ours as we might think. So, when we speak of the Dark Ages, perhaps we should remember that darkness is not just about ignorance, it's about the shadow cast when powerful institutions stand between people and their most basic instincts. In that shadow, you'll find bundling bags, bull testicles, gemstone belts, and 1,000 other reminders that human nature will always find a way to express itself, no matter how strange the form. In the quiet reading rooms of Europe's oldest libraries, the truth of these practices lingers in parchment and ink. Medieval cookbooks list recipes that read like a cross between a feast menu and a magical spell. Legal records detail annulments, trials, and humiliations in words as dry as dust, masking the raw human drama beneath. These documents are the breadcrumbs of a hidden world, a world where lust, law, and lore collided. Some of these records are chilling in their brevity. A single line might note marriage annulled due to proven impotence without describing the weeks of intrusive examinations and public shaming that led to it. Others read almost comically recounting cases where witnesses at a bedding ceremony fainted, or where a groom fell asleep mid-act, sparking legal debates about whether unconscious consummation counted. And yet behind each entry was a human story of a bride coerced into public intimacy, of a husband terrified of being found wanting, of families calculating political advantage with no regard for personal dignity. These were not faceless medieval people. They were individuals caught in a web of beliefs and systems that often left them with no truly private choices. By piecing together these fragments, we can see the Middle Ages not as an alien past, but as a mirror, albeit a warped one, reflecting the timeless dance between power and passion. The forms have changed, but the tensions remain: who gets to control desire, who profits from it, and who is shamed for it. Even the Church's brothel empire, unthinkable to many today, was rooted in a logic still recognizable: regulate, vice profit from it, and justify the contradiction with moral arguments. It's the same reasoning behind countless necessary evils throughout history, from state-run lotteries to legal loopholes that benefit the powerful. Likewise, the endless fertility rituals and contraceptive myths speak to a human impulse that transcends centuries: the urge to master the unpredictable. Whether the goal was to produce an heir or avoid another mouth to feed, people clung to any method that offered hope, however misguided. It was trial and error on a generational scale, with lives and legacies hanging in the balance. If there is one lesson to take from the bizarre sexual practices of the Middle Ages, it is that human sexuality cannot be neatly contained. You can legislate it, ritualize it, shame it, or sanctify it, but you cannot erase it. Instead, it will adapt, mutate, and find expression in ways that surprise, amuse, and sometimes horrify. And perhaps that is why these stories endure. They fascinate us not only because they are strange, but because they reveal a truth we often try to forget: we are not so different from our ancestors. We may dress our desires in the language of science, psychology, or personal freedom, but the same old mix of longing, fear, and ingenuity still drives us. So, the next time you hear someone dismiss the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance and repression, remember the bundling bags, the gemstone belts, the aphrodisiac feasts, and the Church's brothel books. Remember that beneath the layers of superstition and ceremony were people negotiating the same forces we do today, just in stranger costumes. History, in the end, is not a straight line of progress. It is a tangled bed of contradictions, much like the beds of medieval Europe themselves. And in that tangle lies the story of humanity, endlessly inventive, hopelessly flawed, and forever searching for ways to reconcile the sacred and the profane. If you've made it this far, you've already stepped into that world, so like, share, and subscribe, because the past still has plenty of scandal left to uncover.